So without further ado, if we have any questions, once again, we'll do about 10 to 15 minutes of questions directly to Professor Appleby, and then we'll move forward with the panelist response.
Professor Appleby suggested we ask a question about his experience.
Excellent. I will. Thanks. And then we'll go turn to the panel. I had a remarkable opportunity. I'll say more tonight about the project that sponsored it. But I was asked to teach in a program that brings madrasa students from Pakistan and India. So these are recent graduates of Islamic schools that focus on intensive training in the Quran and the Hadith and the sacred sources of Islam, primarily the Quran. And they are young men aged 20 to 35 who are from Pakistan or from India. And we met in Nepal because, as you know, India and Pakistan are often in conflict, and Nepal was a neutral space. And they are part of a program at Notre Dame that puts their Quranic education into context of history, comparative religions, science, because their education has been pretty narrowly focused on basically scriptural interpretation, if I can use that term. So, so I had the wonderful privilege of talking to them about Catholicism in the 20th century and how Catholicism has encountered in that century the modern, the secular, pluralism, all the challenges to a kind of pre-modern faith. I talked to them one session about fundamentalisms, a little wary about whether I should talk to them about that, but they loved it and recognized it and cheered part of it on and didn't cheer other parts of it on, but they were really good. So the story I'll tell is this. This is about different ways of interpreting sacred texts. And of course, we knew going in that the Quran in the Muslim imagination, I use the term imagination in a very robust sense. In the Muslim worldview, in the Muslim imagination, the Quran is the direct recitation of the angel Gabriel to the prophet. So it's God's word, the recitation. It's not through evangelists who are inspired by God, it's etc. So it's a different notion. And these are the hardcore Quranic scholars. You know, they brook no modification of that. So after a couple days, intense days with them, and they were lovely people. Barbara and I really enjoyed them. They were very respectful. They were as smart as they could be, very much ingrained in this worldview. One day, after 2 days, and they kept asking various questions about Christianity, I said, okay, what I'm going to do tomorrow is I'm going to talk about Christianity for 2 hours. I'm going to tell you what Christianity is from Jesus to the early church. Now, this will be Scott Appleby's version, obviously, in 2 hours. So I did that, and I kind of just put aside the text, and I said, here it is, and trying to recognize that they think we worship 3 gods, et cetera, you know, that we're polytheists, that Christians are polytheists because of the Trinity and so on. So the one piece that I'll mention is sometime during that 2 hours, I was trying to explain that the New Testament as a scripture, in my understanding of it, and in the way I was trained in, I'm not a biblical scholar, but the way I was educated at the University of Chicago Divinity School, where I got most of my scriptural formation, was that, you know, the New Testament is the witness of the early church to Jesus. It is not a historical record of the earthly Jesus. It is both a memorial of the earthly Jesus and of the risen Lord in the Spirit leading the church. So it's a complicated text. It's believed to be inspired. It's a sacred text, but it represents multiple perspectives on the one Christ, the one Jesus. So 4 evangelists, the Apostle Paul, and so on, and it is coherent, but it's also representing both the earthly experience of Jesus and then people like Paul the Apostle who didn't know him in the flesh, but knew him through the risen Lord. So it's a complicated document in that sense. All right. So one thing I said during that is that the New Testament is written in Koine Greek. It was written by the evangelists 30, 40, whatever, how many decades after Jesus had died. Jesus, of course, speaks Aramaic to people in Palestine, a kind of backwater of the empire, and he's he's addressing an audience who has certain kind of culture, history, horizons of understanding. When the evangelists are writing the New Testament about Jesus, they're writing to the Roman Empire, and they're writing in Greek, to the language of the empire at the time. It was still Greek, wasn't yet Latin. And so it's written in Greek. Boom, I'm finished. That night, we had an evening session. They all came together to ask me, I said, there were a lot of questions about my 2 hours on Christianity, of course. I said, we'll do it tonight. Let's go back to. So that night, the first question was, I had told them there's a lot of things, what I gave you today, there's a lot of interpretation in religion, and you have to have hermeneutics, and you have to know why you're interpreting. So one of the scripture scholars there, the Quranic scholars, raised his hand and said, Sir Scott, as they called me, Sir Scott, you said that the New Testament was written in Greek. Is that your interpretation? And I said, no, that's a fact. There's facts and then there's interpretation. That's a fact. There's no dispute among scripture scholars what the original language of the New Testament has been translated. They said, that can't be true. Because the Holy Quran says that the revelation of Jesus is in Syriac or some form, kind of close to Aramaic, as I understand it. And I said, I can't really say to them in respect, well, the Quran is just wrong on this. But I did say something like, well, the Quran is just wrong on that. It's just not the case that the Quran is written, that the New Testament is written in Syriac. And I had, luckily, a colleague who was moderating this conversation. It was all very civil and friendly. But I learned this, that they could not, they basically, I had told them that I have a son named Paul who was born on June the 29th. It was the feast of St. Peter's and Paul. And so I named this son after Paul the Apostle. I realized that they believe that Paul is the villain in the piece. And that because Paul is one of those who didn't know Jesus or the prophet and who led this Hellenizing, taking it to the Gentiles and so forth. And I had said something, if Jesus did say in Matthew 16 to Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, if he actually said that to Jesus, to Peter in the flesh, Peter, was never considered to be a Rhodes Scholar, but he would have had to be really dumb to then later in the Council of Jerusalem say, I don't think we should have a church, which is what his argument was. He was first with the Judaizers. So I was saying, that Peter comes to that awareness of the church through the risen Lord commissioning the church. So anyway, they think their response was, Jesus is a prophet, and the language of a prophet, the language of God, is Arabic. Or at the very least, his own language, Aramaic. That's your problem, you Christians. You translated that right away into a different milieu, a different context, different language. And this Paul the Apostle distorted it. And then you came up with the Trinity, and you came up with this, and you came up with that. Now, in a way, they're right. I mean, I don't agree with their conclusion, but they're on to something. From their model of revelation, and I'm talking about a subset of many different, I'm not speaking for all of Islam, I'm talking about these Indian and Pakistani young scholars who are leaders in their communities in India and Pakistan. But from their perspective, that is the problem. The interpretation, the adaptation, the deviance, as they would see it, from Jesus' own words in Aramaic, because he's the inspired prophet. So I knew this in a kind of way, but I really learned it. I really understood their worldview. So more to say about that, but that was the experience. It was a wonderful experience, actually, for me, a great learning experience.
Maybe one more question directly to, go ahead.
I want to pose this question from the perspective of a pastor. This is what I witnessed in 2 congregations I've served. In our encounter with conflict of interpretations of ultimate reality, it's one of 2 responses. First is to give up what is distinctive to one's own tradition, and the other is to demand a stronger confessional identity. And I wondered if you could comment on those 2 reactions. I mean, part of me, I think, will acknowledge that the impulse to self-definition, both on a personal and communal level, is both necessary and healthy. On the other hand, your discussion about fundamentalism is not. So I guess I'm asking, how do you navigate between the skill and the share of these here?
It's an excellent question. I'll say more about this tonight. It's in the presentation tonight, but briefly, two things. One does not put aside one's own confessional identity. So if you're a Christian, let's take Christians, and I'm glad that we have a panel who come from different traditions than I do, because I've used a lot of Christian and sometimes Catholic because that's what I know best. So I'm going to use another Christian example. So if you are welcoming a Jewish or a Hindu or a Muslim or another kind of Christian even, or a non-believer, whatever, to your home, and you recognize you want to be hospitable to that group, to the others, call them the other for now. One doesn't take the crucifix down. One doesn't move the religious art in the home. One has to be true to oneself and understand their approach to ultimate reality to come through this hallowed, precious channel, however complicated that is for the person. On the other hand, so that's one. On the other hand, there may be a little house cleaning involved before the guests arrive. And that may involve a kind of critical take on those symbols, an awareness of the critical take. So the cross, as we know, is a controversial symbol, right? Not only for the many people who have been conquered under the sign of that cross and subjected to slavery or various forms of oppression, but to many women today who believe that Christianity and the cross has been used to beat them into submission out of, back to Paul the Apostle. I shouldn't laugh about that, but you know, my son Paul, all the things I burdened him with by naming after that apostle, who many feminists say that's one of the sources of text of patriarchy, wives submit to your husbands and so on. So on the one hand, to be traditional, final way to answer this, I enjoin upon people being traditional, to be traditional, by which I mean this. To be a fundamentalist or a liberal or whatever are different options. The traditional option is, I have inherited in my life as a Christian, to again take that example, a very complicated, multivalent, multivocal tradition that in the case of Christianity goes back 2,000 years. It has episodes of heartbreaking sadness and oppression and under the name of the cross. It has moments of incredible healing and what one would expect and one aspires to in grace. It has symbols that are now broken in many eyes, and I struggle with that. But I adhere to it nonetheless. Anyone who's part of a family knows what this means, to adhere to the family, even though Lord knows it's dysfunctional. Lord knows it's filled with sin and suffering. Well, this is my family, and I need to embrace it, warts and all. But it's a struggle. That image of the struggle of Jacob with the angel of Israel, the one who has struggled. It's a constant struggle. So you embrace it. You don't put it aside. It's mine. It's ours. You're welcomed into that conversation. I'm going to say more tonight about the next step in that, which is the risk of being transformed by the other, even as you stay rooted in your own tradition. So tradition means I don't select from it the things I like and ignore the others. I am nourished by the things I find to be healthy and nourishing and good, but I don't pretend that the other is not part of it. And I have to struggle with that as well, and struggle with my own limitations and blindness, and keep open up opportunity that maybe the church is right about this when I think they're dead wrong, and maybe they're dead wrong, meaning the authority structure of the church.
Okay, well, I think now at this point in time we'll go to the panel, and I guess we'll start start on this end, perhaps, with some response of the panelists to our presentation.
Thank you. Thanks, Scott. That was an excellent presentation, very edifying. I just had a few sort of observations that I wanted to share, because the framing question for us is, can religions collaborate for the common good? And the obvious answer seems to be yes, they can, because we see it happening, right? And so that's definitely one answer that could be given. But what I'm going to do is actually focus on three things within that larger answer, which I think is a credible answer, as to what does it mean to think about this question in the first place. So the first thing I want to say is, I think part of the challenge of interfaith work is, I think, the objectification of religions. Because the way we ask the questions, can religions collaborate, takes away some agency from religious actors. I always think of it this way. We usually don't use this language in other fields. So we don't say medicine performed a good surgery. We say the doctor did a good surgery, or the doctor did a bad surgery. And so I think there is something that is gained by keeping attention on the people who act or perform or do things in the name of religion, because that's really what it is. I always think of religion as this inanimate phenomena made up of beliefs and practices. It in itself has no agency. To it, agency is given by us, actors who work, perform, speak, do evil, do good in the name of religious ideas and practices. So in some way, I think, how can we better collaborate? Can we collaborate? Part of the answer is the focus needs to be on people. The focus needs to be on religious actors. That's where the transformation begins. It's usually too general a statement to say, let's try to make Islam and Hinduism work together. It's better to say, let's try to make Muslims and Hindus work together, because that, I think, has more potency there. I think the second big thing I want to talk about, really, at least in the context of both the presentation and my own sense of these things, is how religion doesn't exist in a vacuum. And I think, Scott, you alluded to this. When we talk about the role religion plays in society, we're looking at how religion intersects with a whole range of issues: politics, law, economics, business. So I just want to share a small anecdote. I was lecturing, actually more speaking, to a group of around 70 Hindu students in India, maybe around, 10 years ago. And I was talking about various things, the American education system, so on and so forth. And at one point, a student got up and said, well, Professor Peterdas, what's your religion? And I said, well, generally speaking, I grew up in the Christian faith, and sort of that's my general family. And then this person said, but you know that Christianity is very violent. I said, well, that's interesting. Let's unpack that. And so I asked, why do you think, why in your image is Christianity violent? And these are 70 Hindu students, graduate students, all shaking their heads in agreement. So I know there's more than just a single voice in the room. So I asked them, why? Why do you think that's the case? So what's your perception? What's the basis of your perception? And this is the answer. When I look at what Christianity has done under colonization and the Raj, I see violent behavior. So the Raj is the British Empire in India, governing for 300 years with all the policies they brought in. When I turn to the 20th and 21st century, I see mostly Christian nations at war with non-Christian nations. And usually these Christian nations are more powerful and have more military strength. And for me, it was a moment, it was an aha moment. This idea that for these students, for these graduate students, Hindu graduate students, they're not looking at Christianity in the abstract, but in the context of political power, in the context of history, in the context of what's happening. And so I think this is also where, when we think of religious actors as either good or bad actors, it helps us improve our understanding, our knowledge, if we can ground their motivations in more than just religious sources. Because I think one of the challenges and one of the dangers is to reduce why people act to monochromatic forces, to say only religion motivated this person to do this. There's always a host of issues. I think the final thing I want to say, and here I'm going to pull in a bit of Upanishads, Hindu scriptures, and Gandhi, but this idea of, you talked about the nature of religion, and that actually brought to my mind this issue of what is the purpose of religion. And to me, it seems like, when Gandhi was asked this question, what's the point of having religion? His response was, religion is the search for truth. But he had a very nuanced understanding of the truth, right? The truth was not yes or no, right and wrong, but rather his entire autobiography is titled Experiments with Truth. This idea that truth is not settled, is open to debate, and is best discovered in experimentation. You have a thesis, you test it on the ground, you don't introduce evidence bias, and then you see where you land. And if what you find doesn't accord with your thesis, then you change your thesis. You don't go around saying, aha, I began with the truth and I'm going to stick to that no matter what the evidence tells me. And so I think, and so Gandhi was asked, so how do you explain this, at least in the context of Hinduism? And this is his response. He referenced the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, one of the Hindu texts. And there you have this debate between a young scholar and a senior scholar. And the young scholar is asking the senior scholar, how many gods are there? And the senior scholar says 3 and 3,000. The young scholar says, yes, I know that, but how many are really there? The senior scholar says, well, actually, there are only 12. The young scholar says, I know what you're saying, but how many gods are really there? And this keeps on going. And the senior scholar says 12, then 6, then 3, then 1.5. 1.5. Try to explain that like half a god. Ends at 1. And then when the junior scholar thinks, oh, I figured it out, there's only one god, the senior scholar says, hang on, there are actually 3 and 3,000. And so we begin the story again, right? And Gandhi picks up on this idea of what is happening within Hinduism, this openness to the discovery of truth in an experimental way. And I think if we talk about how religions can collaborate, at least recognizing how do we approach truth? Do we approach it in an absolutist sense, or are we open to experimenting with our notions of truth and dogma and doctrine? I think can be helpful and can help again towards answering this question, can religions collaborate for the common good?
That's very good. Thanks. Well, I want to first thank the invitation for being here to Dr. Gano and others. Professor Appleby and I first met several years ago when I was on sabbatical at Notre Dame, looking into creating a Peace and Justice Studies major program at Aquinas. But I really appreciate your conversation about naming your children. My parents, I once asked them why they named me Roger, and they said, well, there's a quarterback at Navy and in Dallas. They fortunately never expected me to live up to those kinds of expectations. So, certainly not that kind of athlete. I want to begin by so I'm a political scientist. I teach international relations here at Aquinas College, and just by adding a few examples to some of the things that you said that I think are really important. You asked at one point, what do we as communities do in response to violence? And in the international system, we often respond by, it's very after the fact, but United Nations peacekeeping operations. There's all kinds of problems with that, and maybe we'll unpack that. But most recently, this dynamic of responsibility to protect. So I just put in for another sabbatical, and it's to do some research on the relationship between just war theory and responsibility to protect. So I'm going to put that into some context. Another thing that you said that I thought was really important, this idea that religions circle the wagons, and I want to put that into context of some political nationalism. One of the best books, if you haven't read it, from our former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Powers, wrote a really good book called A Problem from Hell, America in the Age of Genocide. And in it she has all these really good meaty case studies. But this idea of, you mentioned Hindu nationalism, I wrote down Sunni versus Shia, Serbs versus Bosnians. The way religious conflict gets codified in nationalism, in nationalistic representation, and then in politics. And it really does get down to the nitty-gritty of who's controlling the ground. And I think those are some of the conversations we need to have. You talked very specifically a few minutes ago about what we call in international relations, where borders begin and end. Well, it really matters where borders begin and end. Ask any Palestinian. Because when Israel continues to allow for more and more settlements, then going back to those 1967 borders that we hopefully can go back to get a Palestinian state makes it that much more difficult. So this idea of putting some tangible sort of international relations dynamics onto it. Finally, on your third logic of fundamentalists, if you will, West toxification, et cetera, really good stuff. The evidence is very clear when we look at even maybe positive participation in political change, the Arab Spring. Who participated in the Arab Spring? The young, the disenfranchised. The young man that lit himself on fire, Mohammed Bouazizi, was a young man with a college education who was tired of getting beat up by the Tunisian police. So this idea of taking that kind of disenfranchisement, maybe disempowered, and turning it into political activity. And it's a much less academic piece, but I'd like to recommend something that came out very, very soon, right after 9/11. It was written by Peter Ford in the Christian Science Monitor. Why do they hate us? And you gave reference to that. You know, why are they confused about what we do in the West? Why do they hate us? And it's a really good piece, very nice piece out of the Christian Science Monitor. That said, I want to talk for just a minute about this tension then between when war is justifiable and this idea of responsibility to protect. Because inevitably, responsibility to protect means you need to use some sort of force to protect those that are unprotected. So we all know that in just war is never justifiable, except. And they make some exceptions. Aquinas wrote about this, and among others. Well, there's three legs to just war theory. There's the justice of the war, the decision to go to war. Is the decision to go to war just? Several categories there. Then there's justice during the war. In modern international relations, we couch that as the laws of war, essentially, the Geneva Accords, the Geneva Conventions. You need to act justly during war. And then a relatively new addition to just war, but especially in international relations, I suppose, is the just postbellum, justice after the war. How do we act after the war? And most recently, that's codified itself into war crimes tribunals. So following the horrific genocides in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, we had very specific ad hoc war crimes tribunals that went after the individuals, but it was after the fact. Following that, the international community created a permanent international criminal court. So there's two courts, not to be confused. There's the International Court of Justice that adjudicates disputes between states, the United States versus Nicaragua, for example, or Nicaragua versus the United States in 1984, 86, when we were found guilty of bombing their harbors. Then there's the International Criminal Court that goes after individuals responsible for war crimes. So the point here is that we're working our way as an international community in trying to respond to this kind of violence. And I think that when we talk about religious communities, this gives some evidence to moving forward in international law and international organizations. Well, because of the atrocities in Rwanda and former Yugoslavia, in 2000 and then again in 2005, the international community created Responsibility to Protect, or R2P. And it's really a new and innovative concept of justifying intervention. So it's based on three legs. Number one, states have the responsibility to protect their populations. We don't say citizens because sometimes people within borders don't have citizenship. So this idea of protecting populations is very important. Now we're thinking right away about the Rohingya in Burma. Yep. Secondly, if states are failing to protect their populations, the international community must help them do so. Thirdly, if states are manifestly failing to protect their populations, the international community must be prepared to respond and protect. And this was first really enacted in Resolution 1970 and 1973 of February of the Arab Spring, when the Security Council authorized the international community to respond to the way Gaddafi was treating his citizens in Libya, or his populations in Libya. So it sounds like a really good concept, and this idea of protecting the unprotected. You can justify violence, you can justify war, you can justify response by protecting the unprotected. But there's all kinds of tensions here. And I think this comes up when we talk about religious confrontation for sure. When, where, why, and by whom is R2P to be applied? When is it just to intervene? And it's very problematic because deciding, first of all, who the international body is to do so is problematic, but of course it's the Security Council, but 5 permanent members, they're winners of wars, they have power, they have their own interests. It's very difficult to get things done. So we now have a norm justifying community or international response to the most egregious examples, but it's very difficult to get it to be applied. So a few years ago, we have a model Arab League program, and a few years ago we were representing Syria. Which Syria did we represent? Well, at the time, the Arab League recognized only the National Coalition, not Assad's government. So we got to role play that group. Well, now that ISIS is around, well, maybe we need Assad to fight ISIS. So this idea of who's doing what and who's the worst criminal out there, this is really problematic when deciding when and how to respond. Responding has to be very careful, especially when we talk about the potential of creating political vacuums. Removing Saddam Hussein in 2003. I was actually overseas when that happened, and it was very good for me and the other students to see the comprehensive and specific opposition to that war. I've argued since then that that was an illegal and immoral move in removing Saddam Hussein. The world's better off without Saddam Hussein, but not the way we went about it. Arguably, it was an R2P. We were trying to protect people in Iraq. But by removing Saddam Hussein, we created a political vacuum, a vacuum in which that ISIS fulfilled. So this idea of picking and choosing when and where we intervene and how we go about doing it is very, very difficult. And I guess I'd like to hear comments about that. Yep. Thank you.
So I often find myself being the token non-academic on a panel of academics, but it's kind of fun. My response is typically 180 degrees from the prior responses, though in this case, both prior responses put their finger on exactly the point I found most problematic about the presentation. Which is that you open by saying conflict is in the DNA of religion. And I was understanding that your goal today is to describe the roots of conflict in religion and the roots of collaboration in religion. Okay? So collaboration being positive, so I understand that conflict must be the things religion produces that are negative, and why does that happen? Okay? So you open by saying something to the effect that religion, apart from the fact that it involves human beings, and then you went on to describe where this conflict comes from. The problem I had is that if you really take that idea seriously and you look at religion apart from the fact that it describes human beings, I think the descriptions of conflict, the examples you gave, no longer apply, because the examples you gave are all what happens when religion is somehow tied up with politics and power. So my counterexamples. In the creation of the Bible, right? I'm speaking as a Jew, so I'm thinking Hebrew Bibles. The creation of the Hebrew Bible. We have almost diametrically opposed stories of the creation of the world. So how does religion resolve that conflict? It just puts both stories in without comment, without problem. It just says, we'll include both of them. And the same thing in the story of Noah. If you read the story of Noah, you'll find a jumble of different information about the length of the water, the number of animals that were put on the ark, but the Bible itself doesn't seem to be bothered by that. So the creators of the Bible said, well, we have different stories. It's not a problem for us. It's not a conflict. We'll just put it all in. Moving ahead to the Talmud, to the creation of Judaism, the creation of rabbinic Judaism, the Talmud is not bothered by the most intense of conflict. They just argue for a while, record both sides of an argument, and move on. There's only one particular example where the conflict didn't end so well, but that's as opposed to hundreds of examples of simply acknowledging that we don't agree, but we'll honor both sides. And so it seems to me that because the conflict didn't become negative, it wasn't violent, it wasn't damaging, even though it was produced by the religion, the emerging religion, we'll just leave it in. So what's interesting to me, and so I'll conclude with this question, what's interesting to me about your example of Nicaea, of which I know virtually nothing, is not that they got together to resolve these conflicts. It's that they had to get together to resolve the conflicts. What made that conflict so damaging that Nicaea was necessary, as opposed to this other model that I was describing and that you described, Dr. Appleby, in your description of the four Gospels, right? 4 different stories, not harmonized to create one story, but just put them all together, and that's okay. So what made the conflict of Nicaea so damaging that it had to be resolved in the way it was resolved? And my guess is that it's going to have some connection with politics and power. Right? So the meaning that's the root of conflict, not religion itself.
You want me to say a few things? Great. Thank you for these great comments all down the line. I'll start with the rabbi's conflicts. Religion, by response, it may or may not answer. Religion is always tied up with politics and power. I mean, this is kind of a circular argument because it's human, it's tied up with politics and power. So, and this also gets at, when we get to the religious nationalism and R2P and so forth, there is no setting, I shouldn't generalize, but it's hard to imagine a setting, whether it's a local, 5 people around a table in a local community setting, or the question of Syria, or the question of Nicaea, or the question of Noah, where there aren't political motivations within a religious context. And you're right, the question is, at what point do those become, rise to the level that you have to do something about them, because it's not just conflict that can be managed, but I think conflict in its nature is about power. It can be abstracted into this interpretation versus that. It can be refined around study. These are ways of softening or mitigating those power dynamics that can lead themselves to, well, I'm going to crush you because I have a different view, and I want to make your view obsolete. So there are various strategies that religions have, Judaism being one of the most notable, of reason, of argumentation that is civil, engaged, civil, and so conflictual, but not destructive. So religions have strategies, and I want to say more about that tonight, that lessen that. But let me add one other thing. So yes, it's true, religions being human are going to be conflictual, they're going to be about power, they're going to be about politics. There is a line of thought, and I think I agree with it, that says religion makes it worse in some context. Why? The stakes are a lot higher. The stakes are a lot higher. There's a scholar named Mark Juergensmeyer. I don't agree with everything Mark has written, but when he was writing about fundamentalisms, or whatever term you use, or about religious movements that are very militant and sometimes lend themselves to violent expressions, not always. He talked about cosmic war. This is a version of what I was saying about the apocalyptic orientation. And that is, look, we're not just fighting here about land. We're not just fighting here about this interpretation of a text. My God, we're fighting about God. And this is a cosmic question. And the stakes, yes, it's conflictual, it's about power, it's about politics, but the stakes get raised when you put God on the table, and when you put the sacred, when you put the holy, when you say this is absolute. I mean, we already have that political tendency, or a tendency to kind of tendency toward absolute, and it's my way or the highway. But when you say this is about the universe, the nature of reality. So Juergensmeyer's argument is cosmic war goes on a long time, it's intensified. And Ernest Gellner, a different scholar, wrote for the Fundamentalism Project a very interesting essay. He said, the biggest challenge, if you consider it a challenge, is not Soviet communism, it's Islamic fundamentalism. Why? Because the Soviets are playing a losing game. They may have a pseudo-religion called Marxism or communism, but they never really claim that it's infinite or it's transcendent or that it's multi-generational. It's really clearly a mundane thing. They expect a kind of quasi-religious martyrdom or a dedication, but they don't deliver the goods. They don't say there's something eternal or immutable. But the Muslims, he would say this is not just our generation. This is not just historical. This is God's word, and we may lose this battle, and we may, bin Laden may be killed, for example, or whatever, but this is not in our hands. This is in God's hands. And that adds, the argument goes, a different dynamic and a more deadly and enduring. Finally, there's a debate in the literature. Are religious conflicts longer lasting and more perduring, or are they not? And the answer is there's sides on both. You know, this is quantitative social science, so you're not going to get usually a uniform answer to some of these questions. Quantitative stuff does give you some very good, clear answers on certain questions. On this one, it is divided, whether or not religiously tinged conflicts are or not. So thank you. Good questions, leading to a lot of thought that we're just touching the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. On Roger's comments, again, a very profound and complicated set of issues raising around R2P, right to protect and just war, that he knows probably more about than most of us in the room do, the just war and the R2P. I'm going to take one little piece of this and not do justice to the bigger question, and that is about the second point that's connected to just war and R2P around political nationalism. Mm-hmm. And this is also about borders and power, so it's a similar kind of theme. So we talk about political nationalism, but of course there is also religious nationalism, and these things are entwined. And you may be referring, so how does religion get involved? There are movements that I do think, and this is to the rabbi's point, there are movements, and I would include many of the Islamic movements that are about religion. They really are about imposing Sharia, Islamic law. Now, are they also about politics and economics? Of course, there's nothing only about something. Everything is implicated, right? So it's a question of emphasis. It's not that this is only about religion. It has something to do with politics or territory or sovereignty, of course, but it's the question of where's the emphasis. And in many of these Islamic groups, the emphasis is, at least in some, among the true believers, and these movements are complex. There are some former Marxists who jump on the bandwagon. There are young people who don't know Islam from whatever, but this is a vehicle. But there are also a core in these movements of true believers. Bin Laden was a true believer. You know, he had wine, women, song, Saudi, money, territory, and he rejected that and went and lived in a cave because he believed in the justice of the Islamic cause. So whatever you think about him, again, please don't have the headline, Appleby defends bin Laden that's not my point. It's that there is a kind of a religious, moral, whatever you think of it, core there. However, there are many battles, and Roger is referring to them, many wars that are heavily nationalistic, and they are primarily about jobs, territory, sovereignty, material goods, so to speak, the things of the world. But religion is so handy for these conflicts. You know, because of the response I gave the rabbi, because it ups the ante, it keeps people fighting, it really sacralizes the war. So Milosevic disinters this Bosnian Serbian Orthodox leader. Milosevic was not, a great Serbian Orthodox, but he exploited the Serbian Orthodox, who are already, as Orthodox, very close to Serbian nationalism to begin with. This is part of Orthodoxy. It is Serbian Orthodox, not Russian Orthodox. Russia, not Greek. They are very nationalistic to begin with for complicated historical reasons, partly against the papacy, etc. So they're very nationalistic. What he needed to do, Milosevic, is get people to kill the Bosnians and the Muslims and the Croatian Catholics. So he disinters, particularly against the Muslims in Kosovo and Albania, he disinters the bodies of this Christian martyr, and he has the monks march around the field 600 years after this battle. And, many of these Serbian Orthodox priests, with all due respect, don't know their own catechism. There's not much push against nationalism. But Milosevic doesn't care himself about orthodoxy. What he cares about is greater Serbia. The Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland, the Catholics were not fighting for more Catholic masses, I can tell you. They're fighting for jobs, for housing. But did Catholic religious identity and Protestant religious identity, did they call it the Easter Uprising? Did they call it the Good Friday Agreements? Did they make it as sacralized as possible? Absolutely. because if Paisley's doing it, then we've got to do it, because you're drawing on deep wells of faith and nationalism, and they're fused. So there is this political religious nationalism that I didn't even touch upon, in which religion gets hijacked, exploited, and reduced from the kind of argumentation, the good argumentation that the rabbi is referring to, and gets reduced into this fervid national, territorial, irredentist, et cetera, kind of battle. A final comment from Professor Das. He said all three things about Gandhi, truth, and the context and so forth, which are absolutely right. I want to just amplify his first point, which I actually asked. I was in a conversation yesterday, and I asked the same kind of question to the speaker. Or her response to me was similar to yours, which is, always remember that I said in the talk, there are no such things as Christianity, there are Christianities. But the more important point for collaboration, for engaging, is there are religious actors. None of them are embodying this abstraction called Islam or Christianity or Hinduism. You're dealing with actors, with individuals. And we tend to think as scholars and as speakers on this, we have to talk in generalities about Christianity to make ourselves understood. But it's particularly important tactically, strategically, when we're trying to work together to remember that individuals, certainly in the modern period, in our pluralistic, multiple minds, we're juggling many identities within the one Scott Appleby or whoever it may be, that yes, one is a Christian, one is a Muslim, one is a Hindu, and one is around the table representing his or her Christian or Muslim Hindu faith. But we're also many other things. We're parents, we're sons and daughters, we're members of a civic community, we're this and that. And so when we're talking about collaboration, we're talking about concrete Hindu people, in a specific time and place, for whom Hinduism is obviously animating and important, but also how they understand Hinduism and how they're going to represent it in the conversation is about who they are as individuals. And you deal at the end of the day with individuals, with people, not with abstractions. It's exactly what you said. I just want to say that it's an important corrective to anything I say that's generalization. Anybody said, you're working with individuals, and you need that kind of social, psychological, individual understanding. This is not in any way a comment to reduce their commitment to their faith tradition, their religion, not at all, but to say they are not flying the banner in their minds or in what they say of everything we would say about Christianity or even or Hinduism or Islam. They are particular examples of it, and I'm belaboring because that makes real difference in the actual practice of working within and across religions.
Well, it looks like we'll have time maybe for one or two more questions. Maybe if we get someone like
I just want to add. I want to add one other couple items here. I think it's really important that you brought up Milosevic. He was the first head of state to be tried. He hung himself before he was actually found guilty. But when a Serb rapes a Muslim woman, that's a form of genocide, and that became very real on the ground. So it's really confusing for me because I was in Oregon. I go home every summer to Oregon, and I saw my favorite bumper sticker. I'm already against the next war. But then I sit here and say, well, shouldn't we be responding collectively? So your line, when you said choose life, protect the vulnerable, stop the violence. Right. Shouldn't we be responding collectively to the violence of the Assad regime against his people, or to the Burma government against the Rohingya? These are really difficult dynamics, and I'm confused every day. I guess I want to hear reinforcement that this is not easy stuff.
No,
it really isn't.
I think that's sort of what you were saying too. And I'm wondering about modern day technology and how that might affect that. Cell phones are only about 10 years old, but when I go back to the third world, I see everybody in the third world has a cell phone. So that means, to me, that we have this sort of new mythology technology that we're interconnected in an actual way. The thing that we hold in our hand can connect us to everyone. So what's that going to mean as our cultures are infected? Is the word that came out of my mouth. That's not really the one I originally thought I would use. But we are infected by other cultures. And we're perhaps learning to be tolerant of other cultures or learning about them. At the same time, I see an awful lot of trolling and violence online, verbal violence. But I guess because I'm an optimistic person, I'm thinking maybe when, this is not optimistic or kind, but maybe as the older generation who's not used to a piece of technology they can hold in their hand that connects them to every other human, maybe when they're gone, the younger people will understand something sort of new to humankind, that we can be tolerant of each other, we can entertain differences without having to kill people. I guess that's, even my question is not well formed because.
So I think that's good. So we have a question there, it's kind of technology as a new variable in the process to Professor Appleby and anyone on the panel who wants to take that on.
The Arab Spring.
Well, why don't we say something very quickly? Very quickly, you opened a big question that deserves a lot more than we can give it. On just the impact of cell phones and communication technology among especially younger generations. We were talking last night about people reading the Grand Rapids newspapers and knowing that those would all be people older than 40. So this technology for younger people, it cuts both ways in my opinion. It is selective retrieval. That is to say, cultures that are engaged across time and space through cell phones or the web or whatever, you're selectively retrieving from those cultures. In my old-fashioned opinion, there's ultimately no substitute for a face-to-face encounter with that complex person, right? So on one hand, there can be some good things that come out of that, but it's selective. And certainly can be selective on the hate side as well. You're selective and you're using it ideologically. But I think even selecting, this is something some of my students may not agree with, I think even only selecting what is considered the good part is back to the question about tradition. We're stuck, this may be revealing my Calvinistic or Barthian or at least Lutheran part of my soul, which is to say we are all and always will be sinners. And that's a very important mark of us. And so we're not going to find a UN or other utopian scheme that somehow eradicates it. So I think you have to engage with individuals as individuals and communities as such, which are going to be an interesting mixture of light and dark, of the positive and of the selfish. And that's not to validate or valorize the selfish or the dark, but to say you're dealing with real human beings embedded in communities who cannot be abstracted into cell phone or medical technology. There's a lot of good things about it, don't get me wrong, and we can list all those, but I think it cannot substitute for that engagement, face-to-face, community to community.
I think there's another aspect to tech which we should, I think, keep in mind, which is the tendency to individualize that technology really has amplified. I think the Rabbi and I were having this conversation over lunch, and we were both talking about how when we think of religious communities, we're actually thinking of communities. Part of the challenge with tech is not just the challenge of sifting through what is good and what is bad, what is a proper interpretation and not, but how do you make any religious claim accountable to a larger community? And that's where I think, I don't think tech firms have figured that out. I don't think we have figured that out, but I think we need to start thinking about this. The problem with not just interpretation, religiously speaking, but the use of tech for religious purposes is that accountability is lost. While what's happening is not so much connectivity as the personal retrieval of our own little worldview being amplified through tech. That has never been the way religious communities have functioned. And this is, again, I say this as a comparative scholar of religion, so this claim could be made in multiple religious traditions. And that is linked to another challenge, which is, and I think it comes back to something you said, Professor Appleby, which is this notion that when religion is introduced into a conversation, it amps it up. There's actually a counter argument to that, because not all religious traditions, even talking about God, end up in destructive conflict. The point being that even if you're using tech to amplify your conversation about divinity and sacrality, that still need not by default end up at a destructive place. So I think in some way, both these things have to be harnessed. How do we make our use of technology accountable to religious communities? And then as we are using tech to figure out religious answers to religious questions, how do we make sure that the amplification, now that they are religious, doesn't mean we end up in hard confrontational positions, my way or the highway. I have the truth, you don't, and that's the end of the game. By the way, just one more thing. Satyagraha, this Gandhian idea, I'm speaking about Gandhi because I'm teaching a course on him this semester, so it's sort of in my mind. So the idea was, what do you do with power when you have it, right? Because Gandhi led a lot of Satyagraha movements. Some of them were successful, many of them failed. What happens when you acquire power? And this is what Gandhi would say to his followers or people who were with him. When you have more power, don't abuse it. So for example, if you are more powerful than the other party against which you're running this demonstration of the Satyagraha movement, don't add in new demands to demands you've already made. Which is a very concrete way of thinking about, even if you acquire power, that need not mean that that power can only be used in an abusive way. And I think, again, there is something to be learned about religious power, that even the acquisition of power need not mean its abuse.
Well, that's probably a positive note to stop on. And so before we thank our panelists, I will say just a couple of housekeeping notes. So we do have our breakout sessions at 4 o'clock, and those are going to be in the building, the Drecke Lack Center. And I guess maybe the easiest way for me to demonstrate where that is located is to say, the building right there. So the building, in a sense, kind of directly behind us, and our staff will help point you in that direction. And the room numbers, of course, are on our program. And then for those of you who have reserved dinner, that will be here at 5 p.m. Tonight. And then I certainly hope the rest of you will come back and join us after you go to the breakout session at 7 p.m. for tonight's plenary lecture, which will be back here at the Donnelly Center. But without further ado, let's please